Lane UU Church, where the minister Abi Janamachi and Katie Romano Griffin are ministers. And after watching that dialogue on YouTube, I certainly agree with her that that would be a good way to do it. So today I'm going to have a seat here, and I'm going to ask Paula questions, and you'll see her on the monitor, and we'll go back and forth talking about the eighth principle. Good morning, Paula.
There. Good morning. It's good to see you and to be a part of your congregation today.
I'm just waiting for them to put you on the screen and highlight Paula, please. Okay. Well, we're glad that you're joining us from your home there in DC. And as I said earlier, we haven't seen each other face to face in person in a couple of years, so it's good to see you. We have seen each other on various Zoom meetings for the UUA. So I want to start off by asking you a question that I think gets to the heart of this process of us adopting and affirming the eighth principle, which is, why should the people of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Los Cruces care about adopting the eighth principle, and what's in it for them?
Yeah. So just from what I've heard so far, it sounds like you care. You already care about it. The eighth principle is about fulfilling the promise of Unitarian Universalism. And I think we are just scratching the surface of something amazing that really it has not been fully accessible in the eighth principle, and some other things that are happening in the world today and in our association are kind of moving us in a new direction, or more fully in a direction that we've been traveling slowly. You should care, because we care about the future of Unitarian Universalism. We care about our relevance today, and we care about the faith journey of young people who are growing up Unitarian Universalists. The eighth principle really does speak to the world that we live in. It matters not only to the people who are already here, but to people who would be seeking a progressive spiritual community. And the eighth principle, I think, gives us a much wider welcome than just assuming that it's understood. I think it's helpful for us to revisit the mid-'80s, when the principles, pretty much as we have them now, were adopted. That was an effort that was led by women. And you can read more about this in a UU World article. But it was an effort led by women to remove the male-dominant language, so that our principles and our guiding documents were inclusive from a gender perspective. There's no doubt that that was an outcome from what was happening nationally in terms of the women's movement. And so our association responded in that way. 12 years later, in 1997, our General Assembly voted to become an anti-racist association. That was almost 25 years ago, but we never went back and reflected that in our principles. I think we have learned more about inclusion in the past 25 years than we had learned all of the years before. And it's time for us just to do an update. I see this as an update to our principles. Now, Reverend Xolani, I want to ask you a question, because your work on faith exemplars, had an impact on me years ago when I read it. And as I was thinking about it, preparing for today, our work around building the beloved community, I think that faith exemplars, it certainly described how I see myself in this work, but I think it provides language and concepts for other people to see their role in building the beloved community. And I'd like for you to say something about that.
Well, I wrote a book called Get a Hold of Yourself, which Paul is referring to, where I expanded on this term of faith exemplars. And it comes from this idea that people who are exemplary in their faith live according to their principles, their convictions, and their deep beliefs about how life ought to be, rather than just having these as things they think about, but actually live them out. And I believe as Unitarian Universalists, we can be exemplary in our UU faith by adopting the principles, especially the 8th principle, but also keeping the 7 principles in the forefront of what we do in our daily life. And I think this work that we're talking about now is a way of expanding that. So
Yes.
thanks for that question.
Yeah, it's almost countercultural, because what we're saying is that we are no longer going to take it for granted. We're going to be very deliberate and intentional in building the beloved community.
Right.
That's a faith that I'd want to be a part of.
Well, that leads me to my next question, Paula, which is, what is the meaning of being a community of communities that you mentioned in your bio?
Yes. So churches traditionally operate on the idea of church as a family. So family is a powerful metaphor in churches, not just our churches, but denominations, probably in many parts of the world, certainly in this country. And I don't think that we have really examined that metaphor and to take a look at whether or not it limits us. Does it limit our capacity? Does it limit our welcome? And so I am proposing that we change our identity by seeing Unitarian Universalist churches as a community of communities, living our mission in the world and working to build the beloved community. We already are a community of communities. These communities in our congregations fuel the church, sustain the church. You know, we have change in ministry, you know, at various periods in the life of the church, but the communities are pretty consistent. And so just to give you a little more context, all churches have music communities. We've listened to yours today, or your worship community. We have our religious education communities. Many churches have a strong young adult community, senior communities. These are communities that function in the church. BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, maybe mindfulness communities. So the communities already exist in the church. The community of communities as an idea moves that to the center of our awareness. So when we put the 8th principle together with the community of communities as a concept, it really is, it's almost a formula. It's the beginning of a blueprint for cultural change in our congregations. And I really think that we need this for the future. We're Unitarian Universalists are up to something big. And the family is a small tent metaphor to describe what we talk about as something universal, but we didn't examine it. And this was right under our nose the whole time. We just didn't see it until now. I'll add too, I think that the saying that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the country, I actually think that's because churches use family as the metaphor. And family Families are closed systems. They really weren't designed for inclusion and for the complexity of life as we understand it.
That's a brilliant way of understanding and changing our perceptions of that. Thank you. How have you seen people's hearts and minds changed as a result of churches adopting the eighth principle?
It's most visible in the eighth principle learning community. We meet once a month on Zoom. In fact, this month is our second anniversary. There is so much energy in that community. People are excited about this. There's a lot of support for each other. There's a lot of exchange of ideas and practices that are being developed. So this is where I'm seeing that change in hearts the most. Plus, we get to invite people in. For example, in December, we invited 4 ministers to come together to talk about what it means to minister in an eighth principle congregation. That's the first time this has ever been a public conversation. So this is all pretty new. It's still young, but they talked about how important it was. There are people who send me emails and they are asking, can you tell me, I'm about to move, relocate. Can you tell me if there's a congregation in this area that has already adopted the eighth principle? For some people, this is a preference. It's what they're looking for. Our minister in the First Unitarian Church in Honolulu said, if you want to attract people under 40, you need to adopt the eighth principle. This is the world that young people live in, that they grew up in. So we're talking about our congregations really taking this seriously and being willing to make the church reflect as much as possible the communities that we are in. There's a lot more that I could share with you, but I invite anyone in your congregation who is interested to join in with the eighth principle learning community. And this is an ongoing conversation. It is not unusual for us to have 200 people in a meeting. That's the kind of excitement that's taking place.
Right, and I've sat in on a couple of those meetings, and I'll probably sit in on more. And after this, I'm going to ask you offline to, I guess, connect me with those 4 ministers that you had dialogue with, and perhaps I can join them and study myself.
That would be great. Well, let me add, and we've heard since then, since December, we've heard from 3 others. So just to let you know, there are many. And today, before you take your vote, we actually have 125 adoptions of the eighth principle. And what's very significant about that, thank you, is up until by the end of June 2020, we had 29. And we were pretty excited about that. It's still, that's how young this was. But in the last program year, from June 2020 to June 2021, that number went up to 117 in 1 year. I expect this year to be very similar. So it just is an exciting time, and it's a great time for change.
How would adopting the eighth principle align with the UUCLC's mission of being a transformative force of love, compassion, and justice in Las Cruces?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because I want to turn it around to you.
I know you would try that. Don't even try it. Don't try it.
You know the congregation and you know Las Cruces. So what do you see in terms of the eighth principle and how it will transform the congregation and its relationship with the community there?
Well, I believe that it makes us or encourages us to be more intentional. As I said about exemplary faith, it has to do with putting your mind and your heart into something and actually living according to that versus just saying the words as if they are kind of rote memory. So I would see the eighth principle as giving us marching orders, if you would, or some type of mandate or charge that says we're going to now begin to align all of our work in the church in accordance with the principle and target outcomes that would be also aligned with the eighth principle.
Yes. And as we do that, we will become known for doing that. And so it'll change our the vision that we have of ourselves. In fact, I can tell you, I'm working with a lot of different congregations, and people are revisioning Unitarian Universalism. It's pretty exciting. And that's why I say we're just starting to scratch the surface. You know, I'll spend a few hours with a congregation and we get into this conversation and people are talking a whole new way about Unitarian Universalism. Well, what happens when that is normal across most of our congregations? We will have changed who we are in the world and how people see us. And that really is worth the investment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that you have offered to facilitate a workshop for us to help us really get deep into the eighth principle and what it means. So what I want to ask for now, until we have that workshop, which we plan to do, is what are the next steps beyond adopting the eighth principle, and what's involved in helping the congregation come alive after that eighth principle is a part of all of our principles?
Yeah, I love the way you asked that question. The adoption of the eighth principle is the easy part, right? Living it is where our challenge and our growth will be. Once congregations have adopted the eighth principle, then it becomes a lens for them to look at their programming and their systems. We encourage congregations to work at grounding the various parts of the congregation in the eighth principle. I heard you mention that, or someone mentioned it earlier today. And so how does worship reflect the 7th and 8th principles, right? What about governance? And we just had a great session on last Wednesday, hearing from some members of boards who are looking at practices and policy changes that align the board's work more with the 8th principle. What about religious education? There's some great work happening in some congregations around that alignment. And so every part of the congregation then should be asking itself, how are we beginning to understand the 8th principle and live it out? And again, we are not going to have the answers right away because we don't know what we still have to learn, but we all can get started. We should at some point, relatively soon, go back and take another look at our mission. Does the mission reflect the 8th principle? And many of them probably do. You might want to make some changes. What about our covenant? You know, is our covenant consistent with our new sense of accountability? Congregations should be looking at widening the circle of concern to see which of the recommendations in the commission's report can be applied to the congregation. So there are many things that we can do, and there's a lot of support and suggestions coming from various congregations. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel on everything.
Well, along those lines of accountability, I have time for one more question. But before I ask that last question, I wanted to just give a shout out to our two team leaders who are not in the sanctuary, but deserve recognition, because if I don't do it now, I'll forget. So it's Shirley Davis and Rod Souter. So let's give them some love for doing the work they're doing. The last question does deal with accountability, Paula, and is what criteria or metrics might congregations use to monitor and inform them whether adopting the eighth principle is making a difference. And if you have any examples of measuring sticks that you can share with us, we'd appreciate hearing some.
Yeah. So I think it's a little early for us to be doing measuring sticks. Let me say a bit about assessments. I have a slightly different take, I think. If we take assessments as we usually, I think, understand them, a list of criteria, a list of questions that we then rank or measure. I am wondering if we do that now, might we be reinforcing the existing institutional structure? I'm really beginning to wonder that, because that way of thinking comes out of, traditional institutional culture, right? I think that there's some other ways for us to assess ourselves, especially while we are so early in the process. This should be a time of understanding where we are, creativity, exploration. And so keep this in mind. If you are interested in the eighth principle and the community of communities, I just think that that kind of measurement is too early. I think we need to have a little better understanding of what the community of communities offers in terms of a structural change. And I don't mean the building itself, but the way we begin to imagine our relationships with each other and our ministry to the internal communities in particular and external communities as well. In light of that, we haven't even developed an assessment for that kind of work. And when we do the workshop, I'll introduce to you a tool that'll help you to do assessment that's not based on criteria that's already set, but it's more based on bringing everyone into a common conversation and us beginning to understand our relative position in that conversation, so that we can think collectively and creatively about how we move forward in a different future. When I think about the eighth principle in particular, part of the power of it is that it's something that all of us can embrace. So there's this power in our collective action. And I think it will not just point us in a new direction, but I think it's going to pull us into a new future. So we can't quite measure that yet, because we're still developing a concept of what that means.
Right. Well, I appreciate your nuanced understanding of that and guiding us in a different direction with regard to how we do the work in the future. And I want to thank you for your wisdom today and being with us from DC and taking time to collaborate with the people of Las Cruces. And we look forward to working with you down the road, and we'll see you in the service later.
Thank you. And let me say, I wish you well on your vote. And so I'll be watching my phone so you can text me the results, okay?
Will do.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
We have been worshiping in our refurbished sanctuary for almost 2 months. We are currently practicing indoor masking and social distancing on our church campus in order to help end the spread of COVID-19 and its variants. And we are also continuing to stream each service in order to include as many people as possible. As a community of faith and generosity, we weathered more than a year and a half beginning last March, during which no services were held in person. Many of the church's expenses continued during the past 19 months, and some will increase as we reopen and expand services and programs. It is vitally important for the ongoing work and health of the church that those of us who are able to fulfill our financial pledges for 2021. All through the pandemic, we continued support of organizations identified by the Social Justice Committee as recipients for our Change for Change program. The recipient for this quarter is Seroptimist International of Las Cruces, which is part of a global women's service organization. Their mission is to provide women and girls access to the education and training they need to achieve economic empowerment. Our local Seroptimist Club supports women's education in Southern New Mexico with their Dream It, Be It Award and Live Your Dream Awards that provide financial support for educational programs beyond high school. The Dream It, Be It Career Support Conference, sponsored by Seroptimist International, teaches high school girls enduring life skills. You can make your pledge or donate to Change for Change by putting checks